So, we know it's bad form to give away the ending of a novel to someone who's in the middle of reading it. My son won't tell me what happens to Professor Dumbledore, even though I read it on Wikipedia, because he knows I haven't read the book. Well, what is culture? When you think of culture, you might initially think of high culture, your Mona Lisas and your William Shakespeares, and that's certainly an important part of culture. But culture also includes popular culture. The things that we do, the things that drive our capitalistic economy, the stuff that fills the advertising media. But culture is also traditional culture. It's what's passed down through the generations. Some of that traditional culture makes it into popular culture, like this little caricature of a leprechaun. Now I wonder, if the leprechaun has just gone under the ladder, does the leprechaun become unlucky, or does the leprechaun's luck counter the black cat? That's something to ponder. Now, magic has to operate under rules, or else it makes no sense whatsoever. So that's one reason why magic is such a useful feature of lots of games, not only fantasy, but also games. This over here is a satellite picture of a huge image here in a plateau. Look, this is a river canyon down here. This is a gigantic image. It's called a geoglyph. It's in South Australia, and it's a huge artwork uh, put in the ground by native peoples, presumably for the gods to see. It's a form of culture that it's not high culture, it's not pop culture, but it's still an important part of human behavior. When we study video game culture, we're going beyond how do you play the game, how fun is it, and we also look at references to games in popular culture. It's how we talk about games in various other media, how they affect our lives when we're not actually playing them. This is a cool sweater, and these are Pac-Man crop circles, I guess. Pac-Man geoglyphs. So uh, it's also about how culture outside of the gaming world responds to games. What does the mainstream source of news, the broadcast and print journalism, what do those sources have to say about gamers and gaming culture? What impression is a non-gamer likely to get from stories written by journalists who are themselves non-gamers? So there's the ongoing story. Here's a girl killed after video game violence. Two teenagers have been charged with killing a 7-year-old girl by beating her to death with moves from the Mortal Kombat video game. And here is a video game set in a church in a Manchester Cathedral, and the church leaders actually demanded Sony apologize for setting their shooter game in a 3D representation of the interior of the church. Okay, video game theory. Let's first talk a little bit about theory. And before we get to theory, you need something to theorize. We'll talk about a text. And by text, I don't just mean a textbook. I don't necessarily mean words. It's really any human artifact. Could be a painting, could be a sculpture, could be a photograph, could be a computer game. Any human artifact that has some kind of meaning, that's built for the purpose of communicating some kind of meaning. Okay, when we read the text, we're dealing with, initially, with content. In games, that's a walkthrough. How do you win the game? In fiction, it would be a plot summary. What happens? That's the most basic level. You have to know that. You have to be able to make the thing work in order to get any further in it. We start evaluating the text, and that's the realm of a review. Is this worth buying? Is it worth teaching? Does it contain values that are worth emulating? When we move beyond looking at a particular text, we talk about evaluating the genre, and this is the realm of criticism. And it asks us, what are the kinds of things that we buy, the kinds of things that we teach, the kinds of things that we emulate? And when we start asking ourselves, what is our criticism like? What are the criteria that we use? How do we evaluate something as good and bad? How does that change over time? How do those categories develop over the centuries? How do they limit our thinking? Then we're talking about theory. And this is really, what are the core values that are contained in this artifact? Now, well, that might be a bit heavy. If you haven't been exposed to theory, perhaps in an art class or a lit class or philosophy, this may be a bit coming at you a little bit fast. Don't worry. I'll go over this concept in several different ways, not just today, but several different times over the course. I invite you to come along for the ride and see what we can get. Okay, let's theorize game skills. Let's break down game skills into these sort of core functions. Shooting is a hunting skill. You shoot at enemies in a two-player combat game. That's all about the skill of being victorious in war. If you shoot at unarmed targets, target practice, that's gathering prey. That's gathering game. That's hunting in order to get nourishment, to get sustenance. In games like Space Invaders, where you have endless waves of enemies coming after you, or the old game Defender, the goal is to defend your hearth until death. That's a core cultural value that's enacted here. Even though the Space Invaders, you always die, the point is it's virtuous for you to hold out as long as possible. So that's a defensive game that enacts a slightly different core value than a head-to-head combat game. Okay, a different human activity is gathering. You gather food, you avoid predators, you identify patterns. These are some core games. Really quickly, let's talk about the game Asteroids. You're shooting at unarmed targets, but you're not really harvesting those asteroids. You're competing in space with those asteroids, because if you bump into an asteroid, your ship will will blow up. So there is competition. In that sense, Asteroids is about managing your environment by culling the competition. But in Asteroids, the best way to win is to reduce the number of asteroids on the screen and hang around and shoot at the passing flying saucers. That's where you will get extra points, lots of extra points that will give you extra lives a lot faster. Now that's the pattern that you identify in a game called Asteroids. There's a sweet spot where you have maybe one large asteroid that's moving very slowly. You've cleared out all the rest so that there's not a whole lot of chance of your ship hitting the asteroids. And that's the pattern. That's the solution where you've figured out the pattern that you need to follow in order to gain maximum points. Our brains reward us for figuring out patterns, because our ability to identify patterns in our environment is what gives us our competitive edge. Now, those patterns can range from, learning the nesting patterns of the birds that you're preying on for food, to figuring out the relationship between the rising of certain stars to when it's time to plant and when it's time to harvest. Figuring out how likely a certain behavior is going to strengthen or weaken our social bonds. These are all patterns that give us a competitive edge, not just over each other, but over our environment. Our ancestors, who got so good at acquiring sufficient resources to survive, had the luxury then of going on to create art and music and numbers and the wheel and the internet, all these sorts of things that you really don't have time to do if you're always starving and being chased by saber-toothed tigers. So figuring out the patterns that allow you to move beyond a sustenance lifestyle is really a step towards culture. All right, let's spend a little bit of time. Let's theorize Pac-Man.